All right, today we're looking at rectangles. Looking at what we know about rectangles, we know that, for instance, rectangles all have 90-degree angles. It's a parallelogram, which means opposite sides are congruent and opposite sides are parallel. One thing we're going to learn today is about its diagonals. The diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. So, a rectangle is a parallelogram with four congruent angles, obviously 90 degrees. If a parallelogram is a rectangle, then its diagonals are congruent. And likewise, if the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. Look at the first example we have here. We have a rectangle, and it says that a rectangular guarding gate is reinforced with diagonal braces to prevent it from sagging. If JK equals 12 and LN equals 6.5, that's this segment right here, find KM. KM would be the entire diagonal. But remember, a rectangle is a parallelogram, which means the diagonals bisect each other. So what we have here, if that's 6.5, the other half is 6.5, and the diagonal JL is 13. Well, in a rectangle, diagonals are congruent, so KM is also 13. Now they also ask us to find JM. That's where it gets a little trickier. Erase this stuff. But what we did is we found that, well, we know that JK is, what did it say, 12? We found that KM is 13, and we're needing to find this angle. Notice that forms a right triangle. The green line segments form a right triangle, with x and 12 being the legs. So we could use the Pythagorean theorem to say x squared plus 12 squared equals 13 squared. Should be a plus right there. If I subtract it, I get x squared equals 25. Square root both sides, and x equals 5. What was x? X was segment JM. Okay. Moving on to the next question. Quadrilateral RS2 is a rectangle. Now we're dealing with angles here. RTU, this angle right here, is 8x plus 4. SUR is this angle right here, and it is 3x minus 2. Now, find x. Well, how do these two angles relate to each other? You'll recall that diagonals bisect each other in a parallelogram, so these two segments are congruent, and if the diagonals are congruent, then all four of those small sections of the diagonals are congruent, which means we now have an isosceles triangle. So these two angles are congruent. So TUP is congruent to PTU. Well, if they're congruent, we also know that a rectangle all has angles that are 90 degrees. So these two angles added to each other, they're complementary. 8x plus 4 plus 3x minus 2 is going to equal 90 degrees. Combine like terms. Subtract 2 from both sides, and 11x equals 88. Divide by 11, and x equals 8. And that's your answer there. Okay. The next question, one of the more difficult ones, right here we're going to be looking at, there's a couple ways we could solve this. One way would be to look at, determine whether this quadrilateral is a rectangle. First of all, we don't know whether or not it's a parallelogram, so we kind of have to prove it's a parallelogram first. And then it would be a rectangle if it's all four angles were 90 degrees. So let's start out by looking at the slopes. We'll start with JK. Slope formula, you recall, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And we'll be looking at JK first, so we'll say 4 minus 3 over 1 minus negative 2. That simplifies to 1/3. We're looking at JK again. Now let's look at the opposite side, LM. LM is going to be negative 3 minus negative 2 over 0 minus 3, which when you simplify that, you get negative 1 over negative 3, which is positive 1/3. Notice those two are the same. That means these two lines are parallel. Next up, let's look at KL. KL is going to be 4 minus 2 over 1 minus 3. When I do that, I get, that would minus negative 2, which would be 6 over 2, which is 3. Then we'll look at JM. JM would be 3 minus negative 3 over negative 2 minus 0. Simplified, that would be 6 over, that would be negative 2, so that would have made that negative 3, and that would be negative 2, so that would be negative 3. Notice these two slopes are the same, therefore these two segments are parallel. Now, in order for it to be a rectangle, what needs to be true about the angles? They have to all be 90-degree angles. And notice something about these two slopes. They're opposite reciprocals. That means every angle is 90 degrees. So what we have here is a rectangle. Okay, looking at this, number 8, you're going to do just like that one that we just did. Your paper is a little clear, but you can still read what the shape looks like for number 10 through 12. And I think you'll be fine on the rest of those. Number 25 is going to be just like the one we did. Now, another way to prove that it's a determining whether it's a rectangle, what we're going to use here is the distance formula. We're going to basically say, here's my quadrilateral, JKLM. I'm going to use the distance formula to prove that diagonals are congruent. If diagonals are congruent, then it's a rectangle. Don't forget distance formula, x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. All right, and that's it.